This is a first century needle for fixing sails and nets. And what's interesting about it is when people hear that story about how difficult it is for a rich man to get into heaven, and it's like a camel going through the eye of a needle. You can see that it's actually much bigger than most people ever imagined, that eye of the needle. And this is what archaeology does the best. It illuminates the background of sayings so that they're real sayings and they had meaning to the people who heard them.
No place on Earth has arrested the attention of adventurers and archaeologists like the Holy Land. But does what we dig up in Israel bear resemblance to the stories that we read of Jesus in the Gospels? To answer this question, we'll follow two paths. We'll explore the process of archaeology with the top experts digging in Israel today. And along the way, we'll join New Testament scholar Dr. Craig Evans as he reveals groundbreaking finds that illuminate the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
The gospel writers simply assume that we know what they're talking about when they're talking about the material culture, which they don't talk about very much. They just mention that he's on the road. We're the ones who have to supply what a road looks like. They're in a house. We have to supply what a house looks like. Because Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, for example, are just not going to tell us in detail. They don't think they have to.
Understanding the time of Jesus can come from only two sources. One is history, and the other is archaeology.
So what is archaeology? Archaeology is the study of the past based on human material cultures. So what does that mean? It means that archaeologists learn about the past by looking at the remains of anything that humans manufactured and left behind. So buildings, pottery, coins, anything like that.
Material culture and text, both of them have advantages and disadvantages in the study. For example, texts are actually giving us a story. They tell a story. All what you need to know is just to read the story in the original language. So if it is written in Hebrew, you read it in Hebrew. If it is in Greek, it's Greek. If it is Latin, Latin. So you try to get it in the original form and not in translation, because every translation is interpretation, and you don't want to get into somebody's interpretation. You want to get it in your own understanding. Textual scholars have their own disadvantages. One of them is, for example, that texts were written by a literate elite. What is the percentage of literate elite in the ancient period? What about the 90% of the population? They are not reflected in the text. So it reflects a literate elite situated somewhere, perhaps sometimes in the capital city or other places. For example, we have almost no knowledge about slavery in the ancient times. Why? They never wrote anything. We hardly have anything about women. We hardly have anything about children. We hardly have anything about daily life of certain people. We lose all these things, and we are confined to the biases of ancient authors. It doesn't reflect the period of time that he talks about. And sometimes scholars tend to forget that there is a gap of period of time between the storytelling and then the text.
Now, as far as I know, the last real evidence for the time of Jesus came from Qumran some 50 years ago. During the last 50 years, nothing happened. No new documents were found, okay? But every day in a dig, a piece of pottery comes out and reveals new information about different times, as well as the time of Jesus. So, digging a first century site in the Galilee, every day you have new material.
Everything in the material culture counts when you're trying to understand a city.
It's not a textual approach. Archaeologists know the text and they look at the ancient environment, they reconstruct in order to see, to draw conclusions.
Suppose because there's a certain authenticity about what you find in the dirt. Nobody has pre-planned what they're throwing away or losing. We find one earring, just like people today who wear earrings, they'll lose one.
There's no questions of representing the entire population. I mean, we see products that were made by men, by women, by children.
And all of that counts for reconstructing the history and how people live. So you get to handle the actual material that our ancestors handled so long ago. Time disappears, it collapses.
What does that tell us about the people of the past? It is a discipline that sheds light on a certain aspect of past life. History is the study of the past based on human written records. So anything that humans wrote down, that's what historians study. They are complementary disciplines in that we are all studying the past, but we are using different kinds of information in order to learn about the past. We literally remove the information from the ground.
Now that you removed it from its context, it's subject to corrosion and loss much more quickly.
And as we remove this information from the ground, we destroy it in the process. Archaeology basically is a process of destruction. Once you have dug that dirt out of the ground, once you've taken that stone out, you can never put it back the way it was. And what I like to say about archaeology is that it's not an exact science, not a hard science, because it's an experiment that cannot be replicated. You cannot duplicate the experiment. You get one bite of the apple when you're an archaeologist, and that's it.
We are in Nazareth, the home village of Jesus. Now behind me is a house that perhaps was the home of Jesus. Recent archaeological work suggests that it does date to the turn of the era, perhaps to the 1st century BC. And if so, it is possible that Jesus grew up here. But even if he did not grow up here, it would not have been far away. And it's quite possible that in his childhood and youth, he walked the very street in front of this house, may have even visited it. From an archaeological point of view, it is significant because it provides us with further information about how the people of Nazareth lived. I would invite you to look carefully at the inside of this doorway. You'll see some grooves in the stone. And this accommodated some ironwork that afforded defense or protection of the doorway from intruders. So this is another indication of something that's more than just a poor man's hovel, but a rather substantial home.
I think Jesus and his family were not at the bottom of the economic ladder. The very bottom of the economic ladder is the peasant and I suppose the destitute, somebody who's flirting with starvation. I'm not too comfortable with the term because it brings up all sorts of connotations, such as the ones I mentioned. A very low standard of living, a village that produces only enough to subsist on during the year, poverty in the way that you and I might think of homelessness today or something like that. These people are artisans, and from all of the excavations that we can do in Nazareth and other 1st century villages in the Galilee, we don't find that kind of poverty. In fact, I would say that that kind of poverty would be virtually invisible to us.
This is a pottery making village, so it's a craft person village. But no village is devoid of farming. I mean, this is an agricultural economy. So the question is, where did they farm? The land in the Beit Netofa Valley would have been very expensive. I think the aristocratic people would have owned it. But you got all this hillside to farm, and they have olive trees, and so they're farming. A large chunk of these people are making pottery, and you can see the process of their learning how to be good craft persons in the wasters and the clinkers that they trained on.
What we find is well-made homes by the day's standards. We can tell the difference between better made homes and lesser well-made homes, but we can't find poorly made homes. We find ingeniously stacked stones making up walls that can hold up 2 stories, plastered on the inside and the outside, that keep the weather outside, so these homes are significantly cooler in the summertime and significantly warmer in the wintertime, and by the way, about as well at regulating temperature as a fine Roman villa is. Because essentially both methods of construction, whether you're using uncut field stones and plaster or well-cut stones, both essentially are making human-made caves. So I would put Jesus and his family certainly not among the wealthy classes, but they're also not flirting with starvation.
Archaeology isn't cheap, so we have a budget that we have to raise to pay for all of this, you know, from our tools to our travel to our publication, and you know, it just goes on and on. Then you have to raise a team.
The challenge is getting everything organized so that it happens all at once, and personnel matters are the most difficult matters. You have to be in the field for 4 weeks straight, and people are not used to being outdoors that length of time. The sun becomes the great enemy.
Every archaeological excavation is run in a different way. I mean, basically the way that the excavation is run is up to the discretion of the director of the excavation.
The archaeological presence, when it's here, has a whole background and a whole infrastructure that people don't even see and don't know about. It takes months and years to plan it.
The planning for next year's dig will start almost immediately after I get back to the States. So we plan out, first of all, the dates that we're going to dig. We plan out where we're going to dig at the site. We recruit heavily to get volunteers and students to come on the dig. The responsibilities of the director are quite broad.
I'm standing in front of the synagogue at Capernaum. Capernaum, of course, was the place where Jesus had his headquarters. That's very clear throughout the Gospels, especially in the opening chapters of the Gospel of Mark. Now, of course, the synagogue that you see behind me was not standing in the time of Jesus. This synagogue is 4th century. It's a beautiful piece of work. You can see that it's made of limestone. But beneath me are the black basalt foundations, what archaeologists believe, in fact, go back to the 1st century BC, the foundations on which the synagogue in Jesus' time stood. Now, we know that because we've exposed the foundations in the archaeological excavations that have been going on here for several decades. So you have to ask yourself, why would anyone build a synagogue of this quality with its ornate columns, the capitals, the pedestals, just the inscriptions, the beauty of the work? Why would anyone build a synagogue of this size and quality on such a shoddy foundation? The foundation not only slopes, as I've described it, in fact, on the other side there's evidence that it slopes in the opposite direction. So here is a foundation that is out of level, it's in poor condition, and it's out of square. The reason for it is, and I think this is the only explanation, is that it was the original synagogue foundation. And notice how Paul argues in 1 Corinthians 3 how the foundation, the original foundation of the church is laid is Christ himself, and we should build on that foundation. And he warns Apollos and other ministers in the gospel to be careful how they build on that foundation. The quality of their work will be exposed someday in the future. So I think this reflects a Jewish attitude. It's not distinctly Christian, but it's a Jewish understanding that you build on the original foundation. And that's exactly what was done in the 4th century when this beautiful synagogue was built. Even though the foundation was out of square, not level, they built on it anyway. So this is the headquarters of Jesus and his ministry, Capernaum. Why Capernaum? Well, it could be in part because Peter's in-laws lived here and it gave them a place to reside, but I think it's the strategic location on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. People could then leave by boat, cross the lake, or sail south to other cities. Also, the roadway. Roads came along the west side of the shore of the Sea of Galilee and then turned inland toward other villages like Chorazin and Nazareth and Cana of Galilee and other villages. And Jesus' ministry was an itinerant one, so although he had headquarters, he needed a network of roads, easy access for quick travel, as he and his disciples preached and proclaimed the kingdom of God and ministered to people. So this is a key location in the ministry of Jesus, and it's gratifying to see the archaeological work that's been done.
So how does one become an archaeologist?
I remember myself maybe 25 years ago thinking, one day I'd like to be leading an excavation in Israel. There's things I would like to explore. There's backgrounds of the biblical text that are very meaningful to me, and I would like to explore that archaeologically, but how would I go about it?
First of all, let me just say it depends on what kind of archaeology you're interested in doing, because there are different kinds of archaeology, mostly relating to different periods of time or different parts of the world.
So, you know, in addition to my academic preparation, I just got involved as a volunteer and began to learn people and the system and the way that things worked.
I would say that volunteers should go into it just very open mind. Before this trip, I knew nothing of archaeology, but now I feel like I could talk for 45 minutes about this site and how to dig up properly and follow the method perfectly.
How one gets trained depends to a large extent on what period of time you're interested in and what part of the world you want to work in. So somebody, for example, who works in Mesoamerica is going to be trained very differently from me. They're going to need to learn about Mesoamerican civilization, and I know nothing about Mesoamerican civilization, for example. Somebody who works in prehistoric archaeology will also be trained very differently. So the kind of training that you get to become an archaeologist very much depends on the period of time and the part of the world that you're interested in.
What was the role of rodents in the society of Bethsaida? Why are we all of a sudden interested in mice? Because mice and rats are always in human inhabitation. You find them everywhere, rats and mice, and sometimes they reflect the population. For example, certain rats would carry disease, and sometimes when we see a decline in human population, we can associate it to diseases, or that there's some kind of epidemic that was spread by rats. We know what type of rats would do that, so if we find these rats in a certain place and we see decline in population, we know why the population declined, and I bet none of the texts would tell us about it.
Problem in archaeology is to turn space into time, the human dimension. You know, how do we think about this in ways we can understand instead of meters and centimeters? Well, pottery is one of the main ways of doing that.
So we have good datable pottery that tells us an enormous amount about who the people who used that pottery were.
Now, we excavate about 3,000 pieces of pottery each day on the site. Of those, maybe 20% are diagnostic pieces.
So if we can date the forms we see, particularly the indicators,
it's rims, handles, bases that are most interesting to us,
then you can turn, you know, a section that you're digging, a locus, into a particular time period, and you can tell them where they are chronologically when they're digging. We read as we go. We don't store it up and read. We read it every day. So when the square supervisors go back in, they know chronologically what kind of terrain they're working.
Anyone who visits Jerusalem will want to take the opportunity to go through Hezekiah's tunnel, as it's known. It was built by, or at least under the direction of Hezekiah in the 8th century BC to protect the city from an expected Assyrian attack, which did occur under the leadership of Sennacherib. And so what Hezekiah was concerned about was having a sufficient supply of water within the city walls. And so the tunnel allowed the Gihon Spring to be directed, its water supply, within the city. And this tunnel is over 500 meters in length, which is very long. The tunnel under Hezekiah's direction was carved out of solid rock so that the city of Jerusalem could access the spring from the Gihon Spring if the city was besieged. And of course there was the fear that it would be besieged by Sennacherib and his invasion in the 8th century BC. So this way they could get down to the spring and access water, carry it all the way back up, and the Syrians wouldn't even know about it and would not be able to pollute it or prevent it. So this was quite an engineering feat, as we will see going through it. Let's go. Now, as you enter Hezekiah's tunnel, you'll find that in places it's rather narrow. Sometimes the water is flowing rather swiftly. Sometimes the water will get up mid-thigh, at least on me, that's the way it was. There were times, of course, as I went along, you'll see I have to lower my head or else I'll bump it on the ceiling. And at the end of the tunnel, we actually come to a place where there's the inscription. This is a duplicate of the Hezekiah inscription celebrating the completion of this tunnel. You're looking at something that's more than 2,700 years old. There are, well, let's see now, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines of Paleo-Hebrew text. This is 8th century BC. We can read it, and they celebrate the work, digging at both ends, meeting in the middle, and coming together remarkably accurately. They were able to do that through sound, and they would tap and they could hear, and they made a join that was just inches off. It was quite an extraordinary engineering feat for that period of time. But this original now is in Turkey. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. Israel was then, and so this is a duplicate of the inscription that is now on display in modern Turkey.
There's not a moment that goes by that I know that we are not changing the way we understand ancient Judaism and ancient Christianity.